Welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of WORKOLOGY.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of WORKOLOGY.
According to the most recent US Census, almost 20% of people living in the USA have a mobility, sensory, cognitive, or other impairment in 2010. Many modes of transportation are inaccessible, unreliable, or ill-suited for people with disabilities and older adults, which means fewer opportunities for employment, housing, healthcare, and education. This podcast is sponsored by Clear Company. Autonomous vehicles offer a way to improve mobility for people with disabilities, helping them not only get to work, but lead a more mobile and empowered life. The technology behind this is still very new, but it offers a lot of promise for not only people with disabilities, but also the aging workforce. This also benefits employers, and those underrepresented groups have access to transportation and filling roles within your organization. Plus, who doesn't want to be in traffic less, and autonomous vehicles offer lots of opportunities for everyone. In this episode of the WORKOLOGY podcast, this is part of our Future of Work series powered by PEAT, the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology. We will be hearing about autonomous vehicles and self-driving technology, how it is being shaped, as well as how this tech is helping change the future of job creation, unemployment, and the talent landscape. Today I'm joined by Ahmete Ben Noon. He is the Vice President of Autonomous Vehicles and Mobility Innovation at Securing America's Future Energy, or SAFE, which seeks to accelerate the deployment of vehicle automation and maximize the energy security and social benefits of the technology. Ahmete came to SAFE from the innovation team at KPMG Strategy, where he advised executives on the implications of emerging vehicle technologies and partnered with IBM Watson to explore potential financial service applications for cognitive computing. Ahmete is a former associate at the Harvard Kennedy School's Science, Technology, and Public Policy program. Ahmete, welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast.
Thank you, Jessica. It's really great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So my name is Ahmete Ben Noon. I am the Vice President of Autonomous Vehicles at SAFE, or Securing America's Future Energy. We're a advocacy group in DC that works on using transportation technologies to improve our national welfare. So we do a lot of work on the energy side to make transportation less dependent on oil, and we also do a lot of work on autonomous vehicles to ensure that they're safe and to help policymakers use the technology to drive as much social benefit as possible. This is actually the culmination of, this has been the latest role I've had in my career. I originally started off as a scientist. I had a PhD in theoretical physics, and I was drawn to physics because I wanted to understand the world at a very deep level and understand truth about the world. And I think one of the truths I discovered, having spent several years studying science in graduate school, was that the most impact you could have and one of the most important things you could do is help drive change and drive a better society through the policy process. And so I became very involved in science and technology policy, which I saw as the way to help science, help new inventions, help engineering accomplish positive things. Because I believe so much in the value of science and technology. I believe so much in its potential to do good things for our society. But I also think our society needs to keep up and understand the technology so that it's used in the most positive way possible. So it's been really gratifying to do that. And I've had a series of several roles before SAFE where I worked on either energy or transportation policy to really help drive technology to do good things for our society.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to have you really talk to us and educate us and share some great insights on autonomous vehicles and how the technology is changing and some of the different trends that we'll talk about today. I do want to talk about maybe some of the fear or concern about technology and automation behind autonomous vehicles while we get started? Maybe just kind of personally, address it. I think it's exciting. It's also a little scary, but I understand the resistance that some people might feel about this new kind of tech and this different way of living. Can you talk to us about how autonomous vehicles are the future and what benefits you see that they will be providing the population?
I think you've put it very well in terms of you've outlined that there's both excitement about the technology and some people are nervous about it. And I want to say this is something that we've seen before with every time there's a major technological shift in our society, there's always anxiety. There's always some anxiety around it, whether we go back to the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century or the urbanization of our society at the dawn of the 20th century, or what we saw around the growth of computers and the internet in the 80s and 90s. And so I think there's a reason why autonomous vehicles are the latest iteration of this. On the one hand, the technology is different. It changes the way we get around our world, and our transportation is just a fundamental part of our identity. It's a fundamental way we go about our life, and autonomous vehicles could really change this at a fundamental level. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about what our lives will look like when this new technology is here and is widespread. I think working our way through this stage is really worth it because of just how much promise the technology has. We need to travel around every day to do our business. We need to pursue economic opportunities. We need to pursue social opportunities. We have a big appetite for travel. And because it's something we have to do, we're willing to pay the price, and we pay that price with our money because transportation is almost 20% of the average household's budget. We pay with our time. We waste about 7 billion hours sitting in traffic, and we pay with our lives. About 37,000 people died on U.S. roads last year due to car accidents, car crashes. So autonomous vehicles offer the promise of getting rid of reducing all of these tolls, giving us back some of our time, giving us back by offering cheaper opportunities to transportation, making access to transportation more democratic, both in terms of people's different financial status, also people of different abilities. And finally, it can really save some of the massive human toll that we pay for the right to travel. Those 37,000 lives that are lost every year, and several million people who are injured and visit emergency rooms every year because of car crashes. So being able to make promise of all that, I think, is something that we can't afford not to pursue.
What are some maybe populations of people that you believe that autonomous vehicles will impact the most?
I think the disability community comes to mind. There's about 2 million people with a disability of working age who never leave their home because they don't have access to transportation. And I don't think a self-driving car by itself solves all of that, but I think the inability to drive is a big reason why people with disabilities can't get the transportation they need. I think the last government survey counted 15 million people with disabilities who were challenged in getting all the transportation they needed. And so this has a follow-on effect in many areas of their lives because it's harder for them to travel. Their unemployment rate amongst people with disabilities is far higher. About 77% of people without a disability are employed if they're of working age, and that's only about 35% for people with disabilities. People with disabilities have to spend far more of their income on transportation. If they're transportation challenged, they have fewer social opportunities, and that leads to worse mental health outcomes. So the ability to make transportation cheaper, to make it easier, to make it more accessible, I think is going to be a real game changer for the disability community, especially if we are able to execute it right.
I really like what you said earlier, and I felt like this is a great quote. Transportation is a fundamental part of our identity and life. And that is true, I think, for everyone. And being able to be mobile and accessible to get to and from, whether it's to work or personal, doctor, for your family, is an important part of life as a human being.
Absolutely. I think it's we don't think of it, right? We don't think of it as a fundamental activity like eating or breathing, but it's just because and it's so ingrained into our routine, but it's what allows us to do everything. It's the enabling of all of our activities. And there's this stat I just read. Before the car was invented, the average American traveled about 300 miles a year. Today, the average American travels 15,000 miles a year. That's a factor of 50 increase. And just because there's all this opportunity out there, and if you're travel challenged, that means you are not able to get to the same opportunities as everyone else. And we think that is something that is something that should be fun. That is a fundamental right. We think it's a fundamental right that should be given to everyone to be able to chase the opportunities to fulfill their needs as a social being. So the fact that there's a new technology that can help with that is really exciting.
Much of your work is focused on developing and introducing regulations for autonomous vehicles to keep us safe. Can you talk about some of the new regulations that you're working on?
Well, thank you. I think the most intense regulatory focus right now is around developing the regulations that govern how autonomous vehicles are allowed on this road. And right, I think it's intuitive to people. People might intuitively think that just like you have to take a driver's test before you get on the road as a person, there is some sort of driver's test for autonomous vehicles. Well, that really hasn't been, invented yet, and the government hasn't fully fleshed out its approach to encouraging the full deployment of autonomous vehicles and letting companies specifically design new autonomous vehicles that look different than today's cars. And that's going to be important because those vehicles could be more energy efficient, those vehicles could be more accessible. And I think it's also going to be helpful to convince the public that these vehicles are safe if there's a well-developed regulatory framework that governs how companies put these vehicles on the road. So I work directly with the federal government and some state governments on that. I also work with a lot of regulations are written by independent standards bodies that are not part of the government but work closely with them. So I work with some of those standards committees as well. I also want to highlight some of the work I do outside the safety regulation part, and that is I'm working with the California Public Utilities Commission, which is the body that governs basically like TNCs, the Uber and Lyft in California. So they are making a rule for what are the rules surrounding autonomous vehicles that are used in ride sharing, and they set up a task force to specifically deal with the accessibility issue. And so I'm on the task force along with a lot of disability advocates and transportation groups and private companies that are trying to determine what the right set of rules are to make autonomous vehicles accessible when they're used in consumer applications in California.
Awesome. I hadn't thought about, our focus is on autonomous vehicles, and I hadn't thought about, the Ubers and the Lyfts and those rideshare services, but I have seen my share of those vehicles out there, and we do want to make sure that they're safe on the road. And I'm glad that you have your advocate hat on as a scientist, but as somebody who is really focused on also accessibility for all persons to be able to access this tech.
Yeah, I know someone who's taking the big picture. I think it's just really important I think it's important that everyone realize that if technology is exclusive, if it's being given to society in a way that leaves large portions of the populations behind, I think it's going to be less successful than if it's deployed to the public in a way that creates opportunities, includes groups that have previously been more marginalized, and doesn't leave portions of our population behind, whether it's the disability community or whether that's truckers who are worried about their job, or whether it's economically disadvantaged communities. I think the more we can make the technology a win for everyone, the more we can drive to benefits to people who aren't necessarily the big winners in the far ahead in our society today. I think the more impactful it's going to be, and I think the more the more society will will want the technology, and the easier time it will have getting the broad acceptance it needs to have that impact.
Can you talk to us about some of the features and accessible components that are being introduced in autonomous vehicles right now?
So I think there's a few companies that are working specifically on accessible shuttles. So I think those are companies like Local Motors and Navia, Keolis, Easy Mile that are making large wheelchair accessible shuttles. And I think those, some of those have wheelchair ramps integrated into them. And so I think there's certainly looking into potentially outfitting some of them with lifts. So I think that those are really interesting spaces to watch. They're large shuttles. They look like they're shuttles. They look like minibuses, and right now they're constrained to campuses and private properties because the regulations aren't in place to allow them to operate on public roads. And technologically, I'm not sure that they're there yet. But so those are, I think, some of those the accessible examples that are coming. I think right now a lot of the technology that's being worked on in Silicon Valley and in Pittsburgh, being trialed in Arizona is pre-commercial, and I think as it becomes available to the public, and I both think and hope that accessibility will be a big part of the design and consideration when companies think about what platform or what sort of vehicles they use. Certainly, for example, going to be easier to retrofit a minivan to be wheelchair accessible than a small sedan. But I think companies are just at the point where they're making those decisions. So I think it's important for us to have this conversation, to stress the importance of accessibility, to talk about the role of autonomous vehicles for the disability community, so that perspective is fully integrated when companies make their long-term deployment plans.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you are listening to the Workology podcast. Today, we are talking with Amitay Ben Noon about autonomous vehicles and accessibility. This podcast is sponsored by Clear Company and is part of our Future of Work series in partnership with the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology, or PEAT.
Podcast support provided by Clear Company, a complete talent management platform designed to help small and medium-sized companies hire, retain, and engage A players. Visit clearcompany.com to sign up for a free personalized demo.
You mentioned a little bit earlier about Uber and Lyft and your involvement on the task force, and really as someone who can kind of be an advocate for the development of this tech focused on people with disabilities, I wondered about product and development testing. How are organizations or companies involving a diverse group of people in that testing process to make sure that we have lifts and design that is accessible and inclusive for all?
So I think it's a great question, because I think it is a two-way street, and that's the reality of advocacy today. So yes, certainly see signs, certainly see companies that are bringing in disability groups to introduce them to the technology, to talk about requirements, and I think I was very encouraged by when Google first introduced the self-driving car to the public. They introduced it by unveiling a video of a blind man who was given access to the car for the day, and used it to ask the car to take him to pick up his dry cleaning and to go for a taco at Taco Bell. Because I think that just underscored how mundane driving is for a large part of the population, but for people who can't drive, those simple tasks, could take up a good part of those days. So when you gave this person who couldn't drive the ability to use a self-driving car for a day, what did he want to do? He just wanted to do the mundane chores that would otherwise have taken most of the day for him. So that just gets me I also think that there is a responsibility for the disability community to advocate for themselves in this role and to be proactive in policy circles and with companies in making their needs heard and articulated, and be speaking with as unified a voice as possible about what the set of requirements should be. And I think we saw some engagement from the disability community when I worked on some legislation that was coming before the US Senate around autonomous vehicles. And that was actually very effective in getting certain accessibility provisions added to the legislation. But I think that only happens when the community comes together to speak for itself and does so in an organized fashion. And it's something I would just love to see even more of.
I've had on this podcast a number of guests that have talked about the topic of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and robot automation. And these self-driving cars are really part of that AI revolution. I wanted to ask you, how are you ensuring that this technology is monitored and being used for social good? And I know you talked a little bit about this, but I wondered about a number of states that are very concerned about letting autonomous vehicles on the road, whether it's for testing and even the eventuality that will be happening when we'll be driving among them.
So it sounds like the question is very, I think, let me answer the question at a high level. Technology is not inherently good or bad. Technology is a capability that can be used, and people and governments and societies choose how they use technology, whether it's to make its citizens' life better or, in other cases, maybe not as good outcomes. So I would say that is a question that really resonates with me. It's the one I've really dedicated my career to, which is thinking through how society engages with technology in order to use it productively. And I think that's obviously a complicated topic. I think it takes time for society to catch up with new technologies. It's a trend we've seen over and over and over again. And I think part of the way we do that is by investing in nonprofits and advocacy groups to have the technical capabilities to interact with technology and help govern it for good, because I think that is an essential part of helping shape the use of technology in a positive direction. Having people who are in positions of public trust who have the capability to engage with the technology and shape its deployment. And so that's how we think about the question broadly. Specifically for autonomous vehicles, I think companies are, let's just say at this point, strongly incentivized to deploy technology in a safe way. Companies that have not demonstrated good faith efforts of safety have suffered penalties and have often had to reduce or make their programs smaller. But that said, there is a huge role for government oversight, for regulatory frameworks, and I think industry does want to work with government because they understand that for the public to trust their technology, they need to be responsive to the public through some mechanism. And the best way to do that is with a government that understands that this technology has a lot of potential and we need to create a regulatory framework that allows it to have the impact that it's capable of, but also provides the public with the reassurance that there is oversight, that there are standards, and that companies that don't make good faith efforts will be held accountable. And I think that's a process. It's a process that I'm part of. I spend a lot of time working on. I know a lot of other people who are dedicating their careers to that part of the process of building that oversight system that allows for innovation and also reassures the public. And I think it's something that we're in the process of building.
Thank you for that response to that particular question, because I think that for me, it's not just about autonomous vehicles, but it's about that oversight across all different types of technology. Autonomous vehicles is one use for artificial intelligence and machine learning. There are many others. And I think that there are other industries that could follow suit to the seriousness and the role that so many advocates are playing in the autonomous vehicle space.
Mm-hmm. I think, right, I mean, you just have to read the news to understand that. Right, we don't fully understand the implications of social media, artificial intelligence, our ability to deploy cameras with facial recognition. And I'm confident, and I'm a big believer and I'm a big optimist in the potential of technology. I am optimistic that with the right resources and the right investments in civil society and getting the right people who are talented, who have the right talent to go into roles of public trust, that we can catch up our social infrastructure and our regulatory infrastructure and our understanding of social spaces to better leverage and use these technologies. I'm particularly excited to work with autonomous vehicles because I think it's a lot clearer to articulate what the benefits are and how it can be impact society in a positive, transformative way. So in a way, I think my job is a lot easier than some people who are dealing with some of the other challenges that I just outlined. But absolutely, I think I'm tremendously optimistic that we can meet this challenge and use technology for good.
Since I work in HR, I am also thinking a lot about how this technology impacts the workforce. And we had an earlier podcast interview with a futurist in the HR space named Peter Weddle, and he shared that the trucking industry will be one of the first to be impacted by robots and AI with self-driving trucks. Instead of focusing on the fears here again, I wanted to get your perspective on how the shift in an industry like trucking will create more jobs.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that perspective on it. And this is a question we get a lot, and it's something that a lot of people raise as a concern, so much so that we spent almost a year working with some leading economists at Cornell University, at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, at Case Western Reserve University, on a very comprehensive report for how we think autonomous vehicles might impact the workforce. And I think what we found was, right, so I mean, if you think about it, let's say back in 1900, every other American worker, almost 50% of American workers, worked in agriculture. They worked on farms. Today, that number is about 2%, which means that most people who had jobs on farms no longer work on farms. All those farming jobs no longer exist as farming jobs. It's not because Americans stopped eating. So let's say you had gone back to farmers in 1900 and said, well, over the next 50 years, the number of farming jobs will go down a lot because we're going to bring you tractors and equipment and better bred crops. So we're going to be able to do more farming with less human labor. That none of them would have been able to foresee that one of them would become an assembly line worker. One of them may have been, would eventually become a software engineer. And we were talking about, over time and over generations. And it's impossible to fully understand what the jobs of the future are before those jobs are created. So, based on every precedent we've ever seen with new technology changes the nature of jobs and it creates new types of job opportunities. We're sitting now at the other side of the Industrial Revolution, of the building of the interstate highway system, of the building of the internet, and we are at what economists call full employment. So that tells me that technology usually doesn't destroy jobs in the long term, and new jobs are created to replace any jobs whose requirements are changed. So, I'm confident that will happen with autonomous vehicles, and we'll have new types of jobs in transportation, whether that's to deal with more people who will be taking transportation on demand. There'll be more jobs in the supply chain and more jobs that we don't really have that we can't even begin to picture right now. That said, we do need to work to transition the workforce in a smooth way with as little disruption as possible. And I think that speaks to the need to invest more in workforce education, in understanding how the skills of the workforce will evolve, and investing in the sort of educational infrastructure to get us there. And our study found that if we begin to put those investments in place right now, the transition to driverless trucks, which we think is a multi-decadal transition, can go smoothly for drivers.
What other industries do you see autonomous vehicles impacting in terms of jobs, hiring, job creation, and employment?
Yeah, I think that's something we looked at in that report as well. And many jobs are impacted by transportation because people have to drive to get to work. Many jobs require traveling and going from place to place in a car. So, I think some of the more visible outcomes of autonomous vehicles might be how it impacts the transportation as we currently are. Obviously, it will change how we buy and sell cars. It will change how cars get serviced. And we think there's a real positive side of that because we think it'll transform the transportation system into a better one based more on electric vehicles and therefore cleaner and better for our environment. Also one that is far safer and sends fewer people to the emergency room or an early death. And so we think that's a largely positive thing. We also believe that it's going to make it easier for people to get to jobs and search for a broader range of jobs that they may currently not be open to because transportation is an issue. And it also will change how cities are structured, because if you start to get rid of parking requirements, which you might be able to do with self-driving cars, we could see the growth of more walkable, livable cities as well, which might give more opportunities for retail than we currently have. So I'm forecasting a little bit far off into the future, but I think that's the kind of possibilities those are the kind of possibilities that we really need to be keeping our eye on so that we could realize them in the long term.
I like the idea of less parking and more different retail stores and businesses, and just maybe outdoor activities that you can take part in your city.
Me as well, as someone who lives downtown, who really enjoys living downtown, and I'm aware that not everyone wants to live in a downtown area, and not everyone wants to live in a walkable area. But I think just given the prices that we have in for housing in cities, I think a lot more people want to than are currently able to. And it will be my hope, if we make owning a car optional and parking optional, more people will be able to choose the lifestyle and living environment that they want, rather than the one that their income limits them to.
Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Where can people go and learn more about you and what you're working on?
Well, thank you. So as I mentioned, I work for Securing America's Future Energy, or SAFE. You can find our website at www.secureenergy.org, and we're also on Twitter. We put out a lot of research and reports, and put on a lot of events in the DC area and also beyond. So if you follow our website or on our Twitter feed, I think you'll be able to keep up on everything that we do, and I hope you do that.
Awesome. That was really good. Thank you. One question I did want to ask you, the Cornell study that you referenced, is that on the website or a link somewhere? Because I think that would be really good to link to.
Sure. So that is, if you want to go directly to it, it's at the web address AV, that's for autonomous vehicles, so avworkforce.secureenergy.org. And that's going to link to some high-level summaries of our report, some of the really deep analysis that some of the teams did, as well as a kind of a 40-page document that wraps it all together and presents it in a way that's visually compelling and accessible way. So depending if you want to learn more about it, that's the place to go, and you can go either really deep, as deep as you want in it. And I'd say we prepared documents for all, for at the summary level and at the really deep level. So hopefully there's something for everyone there. And again, that's avworkforce.secureenergy.org.
Awesome. I will make sure we add it to our podcast transcript so people will be able to get directly to it, but I'm excited to check it out myself.
Great. Well, thank you. And yeah, it's a really exciting time to be working in transportation and autonomous vehicles and technology. So really would love to hear from any of the listeners. You can find me through the website, and looking forward to keeping engaged.
The Workology Podcast Future of Work series is supported by PETE, the Partnership on Employment and Accessible Technology. PETE's initiative is to foster collaboration and action around accessible technology in the workplace. PETE is funded by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, ODEP. Learn more about PETE at peteworks.org. That's PETEWORKS.org.
As Amite said, transportation is a fundamental part of our identity and life. Autonomous vehicles make mobility and the ability to get around just to live and work that much easier, especially with underrepresented groups like people with disabilities. We are at full employment, and as employers, we need to look at different talent pools to fill our current and future roles. The workforce in the world, driven by technology, is certainly changing things. We are truly living in an exciting time where the world is shifting. Jobs, even 15 years from now, when my daughter enters the workforce, will be so very different. It is up to us as HR and workplace leaders to help drive conversations and lead the way. The Future of Work series is in partnership with PETE, and they are one of my favorite groups to work with. Thank you, Pete, as well as our podcast sponsor, Clear Company. Have a great day.